Hey guys, welcome back to another podcast. Today we are with Dan. Dan, can you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and the company?
Sure thing. So my name is Dan Van Wagenen. I am the co-founder and chief technology officer for Minerva Cyber Technologies. I also have a few other extracurricular activities where I am a co-founder and vice president of the Association of the United States Cyber Force, or AUSCF, which is my nonprofit. And I'm also involved in some other businesses that are not yet public. So Minerva Cyber Technologies is a full-fledged, full spectrum cyber operations, cybersecurity company. Also getting increasingly into AI because I don't know anybody in the tech space who isn't. But our pillars are pretty cut and dry. We have our hands-on keyboard cyber operations and cyber security activities. We have our MSP managed services provider for the security world. We also have an in-house custom research and development or tooling software engineering lab we bill as the SmartWorks. And we're getting increasingly involved in the CMMC program, which is servicing the defense industrial base. So why do I share that with you? We run the gamut on different segments of the market that we interact with, that are our clients, starting with the U.S. federal government. That's actually where I spent the bulk of my career, both with the U.S. Army and as a government civilian. And now I'm on the contractor or industry side of things. So I've kind of seen it from all angles. But we also do state and local, educational, tribal, or SLED government work. We do business to business, think vanilla commercial work with some of the bigs like Microsoft, et cetera. And again, increasingly, we're doing more and more with companies small and medium size in the defense industrial base. And the defense industrial base, or you might also hear it referred to as the DIB, is just a collective term for all the companies in the United States that do business with the Department of War or the military services.
Awesome. So it seems like you guys have your hands in a lot of different kind of, I'd say, niches when it comes to cybersecurity. Can you tell us exactly today what your guys' kind of main focus is? It's a new year. It's February now, even though time seems to be flying. What is the main goal for this year?
Growth, short answer. So your viewers may be aware, 2025 with the new administration was in particular a very tumultuous year, a very disruptive year for those of us that were strictly working in the U.S. federal government space alone, with DOGE and rescission packages and continuing resolutions. So fortunately, we were very early forced to pivot to diversifying our cybersecurity portfolios. So yes, we had some pretty good, juicy cyber operations work with the U.S. government. Unfortunately, we did lose some of that with DOGE making the rounds and making the cuts that they did. So that really forced my business partner, Kim Irving, and I to focus on how do we grow the company in an age of uncertainty. And under her leadership, my leadership, we were very successful in getting into the commercial partnership world. We were very successful in pivoting to SLED or SLED government with state and local municipalities in particular, especially those that are critical infrastructure providers.
Mhm.
It was just a wild ride, the likes of which I hope we don't repeat anytime soon. But
Mhm.
we are making up those gains. I would posit to say that it's the end of February 2026. I think we're back to where we were, maybe a little above, and the future's bright.
Awesome. Did the big cuts in the government, did that make you want to pivot more away from government helping the government with the contracts over there and pivot more into the business side of things with enterprises, or how did that kind of look?
Well, let me start by saying it wasn't our choice. I spent most of my life in the U.S. federal government space, as I said, as a soldier and a government employee. But, that's still very near and dear to my heart. That's very
Mhm.
near and dear to Minerva Cyber Technology. That's where we started. And we still have a pretty healthy chunk of work with U.S. military combatant commands, or what's commonly referred to as the fourth estate, defense agencies, if you
Mhm.
will, as well as Department of State or Department of Energy and some of the national labs. We're still there, and we still
Mhm.
have the desire to move their missions forward. I think, if anything, what we took away from 2025 and DOGE and things like that was a sharpening of the focus.
Mhm.
Cyber in 2026 is very different from where I started in 2003, when we just simply referred to it as information security. And there wasn't all these subdomains and disciplines that we have today.
Mhm.
So we really honed in on hands-on keyboard activities. Think, SOC or Security Operations Center, activities, your incident responders, your active network defenders, to custom software development or tooling,
Hmm.
tool development. And we rounded out very nicely with governance. So that's your CMMC on the DIB side, that's your more traditional risk management frameworks, think NIST SP 800 series work on the government side. We really narrowed our focus on the federal side to those three lines of effort.
Would you say that 2025 was your hardest year in business?
Oh, by far. I've
Hmm.
been in the private sector now for pushing a decade. Been at a couple of companies that were very successful. Minerva is the first company I've ever co-owned with my business partner. But I don't think anybody saw 2025 in the federal space coming. Even some of I call them the graybeards, right? The people that have been in industry for many, many years. They had survived sequestration under the Obama administration and things like that. COVID when that
Hmm.
first hit, and that was a major disruptor to business. Everybody I've talked to who's been in the game far longer has said the same thing. And that's nobody saw the disruption in 2025 coming the way it did. And to some extent, we're still feeling that. We're still seeing it in 2026. I don't know if your viewers saw the State of the Union last night. I was kind of hoping for some more policy nuggets of wisdom on,
Hmm.
where the economy would go. Would we have a
Hmm.
budget? Would we get out from under a continuing resolution? So a lot of things I think are still very uncertain in
Hmm.
the federal space for this year.
Now, speaking about growth, I'm sure that 2025 taught you a lot about growth. And what would be some of those experiences and those things that you learned that you would tell somebody that is trying to grow their company today or start their company today?
I would say for anybody who's interested in going into government contracting or defense contracting, that world that revolves around the federal government, how do I want to phrase this? I would be very careful with launching a business today or trying to grow that business today. It
Uh-huh.
used to be you could be a serial entrepreneur and you could start up multiple companies in the federal space. And that was all you did. You could be reasonably successful as a subcontractor or even maybe a
Mhm.
small prime. You could exit and then start all over again. If there's one thing I took away from 2025, especially in the tech world, it's that you have to be diversified. So
Mhm.
you could still start a company that aims to go into the federal space, but I would really leverage those corporate partnerships and Amazon with AWS, Google, Microsoft, all the super bigs, they have those types of programs. I would really recommend people look at going there as well as, your sam.gov or getting
Mhm.
on the GSA multiple schedules. You don't want to be what I would refer to as a one trick pony in today's day and age. It's
Mhm.
almost certain that you probably won't survive. And a fun fact that your viewers may not be aware of that are interested in going into the federal space is the DIB has traditionally contracted over the last several decades. And there's a couple of theories why. It may be, barriers to entry with a facilities clearance or things like that, but there's not enough companies going into the space, which I also view as a problem. So I don't want to, steer people away from that market segment, but I do want them going in with eyes wide open.
Now, client acquisition is a big part of growth when we talk about growth because you can't grow if you're not landing more clients. What are you specifically doing
Yes.
to acquire more clients? And what does your current client acquisition kind of look like?
So our client acquisition is probably a little bit different than what you would see in the vanilla commercial sector. And a lot of those tech companies that service B2B or even B2C, they have their traditional leads, their prospecting that then turns into new business or maybe new accounts. The government space in particular, which I think is where you want me to go, is entirely different. You can't market to federal government in the same way that you could market to a mom and pop store or a B2B technology company. So you have to play by their rules. And in many cases, that means you have to go to where they are.
Mhm.
So that includes conferences, days, maybe even working with some large prime companies like Lockheed Martin or Boeing or Booz Allen Hamilton.
Mhm.
That's where you go to find your work, right?
Now, on the flip side of that, when we're talking about commercial businesses, what does it look like for them?
I would say certainly it's a lot less hoops to jump through. There's
Mhm.
far fewer barriers to entry. So that's also going to where the customers are to a point. That's going to trade shows or other types of conferences. But you can also do regular advertising. I have business associates or teaming partners that do traditional, radio and TV advertisements, and that works for them with whatever technology product or services they're selling. So it really widens the aperture, and you have to do what gets results. For example, if you're a tech company and you're trying to attract a tech clientele in 2026, I don't know if you've ever been to like a diner that has like the placemat with all the little advertisements on it.
Mhm.
That's not really probably going to be the most bang for the buck, right? You want an ROI that can be measured with, targeted ads on social media,
Mhm.
or, one of the things I see in the DC area in particular, a lot of small businesses will do like roadside adoption. They'll get their big logo on a sign that government buyers, decision makers will see every day they go home. So that's going
Mhm.
to increase their chances of getting work should they bid on a contract, either as a prime contractor or as a teaming member as a subcontractor.
Awesome. Awesome. Now, speaking more on the commercial side of things, well, when you're getting these contracts from the government, they see the value in your service. Now, on the commercial side, it's a little harder to present your value because a lot of these commercial businesses, they might see cybersecurity as just an extra expense, right? That they don't want to pay for. How do you get your message across and get these companies to see the value in your product of that when they actually are spending money with you, they are seeing an ROI from being protected by any attacks?
Understood. And it is very hard to measure cybersecurity success in some ways, because if you haven't been hacked, sometimes that, misguides leaders. Like, why are we spending so much money on Splunk licensing, or having a managed services provider or cybersecurity services provider, et cetera. And it can be a little misleading, that can then set a company up for failure. So one of the things we try to do is educate.
Mhm.
Minerva Cyber Technologies, myself, my business partner, all our senior leaders, were very hands on. And unlike some of the other companies you might see out there, we're not deliberately trying to scare the potential client. We want to go in there again, eyes wide open, to say, look, here's what's out there. Here's what we know known threat actors like, the Chinese government or cyber criminals operating out of Russia go after, and really tailoring a cybersecurity solutions package to their needs. If you're, just to use the diner example again, a small mom and pop owned diner, and you don't have a lot of computer systems outside of your point of sale system, you're probably not going to need your own in-house, SIEM, right? Security event information management security stack. It would be overkill.
Mhm.
But let's just say maybe you're a small lawyer shop, you're one or two lawyers in private practice.
Mhm.
Well, you want to safeguard, your clients, you want to safeguard your points of sale, you want to safeguard, the casework you're doing. And in many cases, there's governmental regulations that they have
Mhm.
to abide by. So,
Mhm.
we're very big on tailoring something that is unique to that particular customer, that actually meets their needs and does away with everything that doesn't. I think one of the major differentiators with Minerva Cyber Technologies compared to other firms is I have zero problem going into a customer and saying, you may not need X or Y, but I would
Mhm.
certainly recommend you take A and B.
Mhm.
So in many cases, we've actually saved our clients money by pointing out duplicative tools, or maybe tools that they haven't turned on that are part of their licensing agreements, getting them that most bang for the buck.
Awesome. Now I want to kind of move over and talk about the elephant in the room as AI. AI is in everybody's life now, and if you don't know anything about AI, you've been
Yes.
living under a rock. How have you seen AI come into the space, and how are you guys currently using it?
Oh boy, that's a very loaded question. Generative AI and agentic AI are almost exclusively taking over the tech space. And I don't say that lightly. I don't know if you saw the viral article post that came from my good friend Matt Schumer over X and other social media. This is probably the most industrial shakeup that we've seen since the first factories in the industrial revolution. A lot of
Mm.
people talked about the 1950s and 60s, the rise of Bell Labs as, the digital age or the computing age. I think AI completely blows that away with allowing us to do more for less
Mhm.
and achieve things that hitherto relied on the human brain. Now we
Mhm.
have a digital brain, some people call it a second brain, that allows us to be more productive, to see more insights, to get more results. And
Mhm.
that has carried over into the cyber dimension. So what do I mean by that? It used to be, well, I mean, predominantly still is, but I think this paradigm is changing over the next year or two. It used to be that the cyber defender was always outclassed by the
Mhm,
adversary. If you think about, your hackers, right? Your scary bad guys, in their mom's basement with a hoodie on,
mhm,
they only had to be right once to get into somebody's network.
mhm,
The cyber defender had to be right every single time. And there were a lot of dependencies they had no control over, like operating system updates or platform and tooling updates, or, being aware through cyber threat intelligence or OSINT means of what was out there that could hurt them.
mhm,
The deck was really stacked against them. And I think the promise of AI in that nexus between cyber and artificial intelligence is that we can flip that paradigm around for the first time. Now you can have cyber defense agents augmenting, not replacing, but augmenting the human. You still have that human in the loop, but they're going to
mhm,
catch things that the human misses, as biological meat sacks, right? We're only so effective because we got to sleep, we got to eat. You need time away to decompress. If you're sitting
mhm,
on the defensive line, you're going to get tired. You have to go to the bathroom. You might have a lunch break or a medical appointment that pulls you away. AI, agentic AI in particular, solves all those problems. Agentic AI, these new defensive cyber agents, they're catching things that even the IPSs, the IDSs, your intrusion protection systems are missing, because they
mhm,
can access real world knowledge in real time from the internet. They can make correlations that static platforms and software can't, nor can humans.
mhm,
So I do see future as being a wild ride, because not only are we having the paradigm shift in favor of the defender, the attackers are also utilizing AI.
mhm,
So all the nefarious activities they were taking part in before have been fully augmented with agentic AI. So if you think of defensive and offensive cyber as two sides of the same coin, they're doing the same thing. It's almost an arms race where one's trying to get in front of the other. And I think we're going to see that for the foreseeable future.
So overall, would you say for businesses or government cybersecurity, has it been more of a net positive or more of a net negative with the attacker seeing more of an advantage?
I think we're starting to see the results of a net positive. In the federal space, one of the, what I would say, few downsides of DOGE is it really forced government requirements managers to focus on what are the must haves versus the nice to haves.
Uh-huh.
And with CDAO at the Pentagon and these other AI centric offices, they're very much looking at being able to do more with
Mhm,
less humans, more automation, especially when you're talking critical infrastructure security. So think like Department of Energy has all these nuclear resources. Clearly, we want to make sure those are protected, right? So while some people would argue the jury is still out, I'm seeing positive indicators that as a cyber professional, cyber practitioner for the last 20 plus years, actually makes me feel a little bit relieved and easier to sleep at night.
awesome. Now let's take it back to years ago when you first started your company. How did your company grow from when it first started all the way up to today? What were some challenges that you had early on and some experiences that carried on with you?
Oh boy, another loaded question. I'll start by saying this. We were very blessed that over the years, my business partner and I had built the network where when we did step off on our own, we had a lot of good people who wanted to help us. Not everybody is in that boat. So the one thing I would emphasize to your audience is, in the world of business, relationships mean everything. It could be somebody you just met. It could be somebody you've kept warm and stayed in contact with over, a lifetime. Those make or break companies,
Mhm,
because you just can't go out of the gate as, a jerk or, a fool and expect that you're going to be successful. The odds are completely stacked against you. I think the last numbers I saw from the SBA were, only half of tech startups survived their first year. And then out of that number, only half survived the second year. So
mhm,
there is a lot of failure. And, I kind of disagree with my colleagues in Silicon Valley. I do not believe, failing fast is a good thing.
mhm,
If you're going to do it, if you're going to put your heart and soul into building a business, you want to do it the right way. And
mhm,
Kim and I think we're very fortunate that when we founded Minerva on March 27th of 2023, We had been in the industry long enough. We had the contacts. We knew how to run business administration. We were able to stand all that up very, very quickly. But we still ran into barriers. In the federal space, you have to have a facilities clearance, which is essentially you could think of as a security clearance for a company. You got to have one of those in place to be able to be a part of a team or bid on work. Well, that took about a good little over a year plus to get that finalized with a teaming partner in the US government that would make us more viable. So
Mhm.
in the meantime, we were essentially, a staffing company. We were buying time by helping people meet their needs with unicorn type positions. Some of those we got to keep. So you have to be flexible. I think it was Bezos over at Amazon who talked about, always keeping your eye on the vision, right? The goal of what you wanted to be, but be ruthless in execution.
Mhm.
We had that to a certain extent in terms of business processes and procedures. And then after we got the FCL, that really widened the aperture of how we could get on teams, how we could bid for work, how we could support proposals, how we could get staffing on different services contracts. And that blew the door wide open.
Mhm.
And there were some growth. We had to, as we scaled, meet regulatory compliance. In the state of Maryland, if you're over 10 employees, you, for example, have to have a dedicated HR person. So we started looking at, a fractional type leadership that we could bring in or augment. We had to bring in a facility security officer to support the FCL. There were a lot of things we had to do to remain compliant and able to grow and do work. So
Mhm.
I guess that brings me to your final point, kind of where are we going? I think because we were resilient, we were flexible, we were able to survive the dogings we took in
Mhm.
2025. It's actually set us on a path of additional success because, sorry, I think we're getting some interference, but we're diversified now. We know our cyber trade. We have the tooling available. Either we developed in house and took to market, or we worked with a teaming partner or value added reseller on. So pretty good, but I don't know a lot of people that can say that.
What is one belief change that you can go back and change that you had back then? Through you just been through a lot here in 2025 with the dojing. Starting your company in 2023, what's one belief change that you would change that you know that if you would change would maybe put you in a better place today?
It's a hard one. I think it would be more qualitative than quantitative. And I
Mhm.
didn't appreciate this early on, despite the God knows how many hundreds of business books I had read, how many threads I had followed on, Y Combinator or whatnot. But it takes a tremendous amount of grit to be successful in a competitive market segment. And I don't think most people fully appreciate that until they're in the arena. And it's that gut check that I think separates those that go on and slog through it and are successful and those that are like, I don't think I can do this, or maybe I didn't plan efficiently, or maybe it's
Mhm.
taking a toll on my family or relationships. Very quickly being an entrepreneur in the federal space, it will separate the wheat from the chaff.
Mhm.
So for people that want to work for themselves, they don't want to work for the man, right? Or a big
Mhm.
corporation where maybe they're a nameless cog. One of the great things about America and our society is, you can take a risk
Mhm.
and build something amazing,
Mhm.
but you have to be prepared for the winds being against you.
Mhm.
And that was probably my biggest lesson was, it's 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. And my other half is like, why aren't you in bed? You've been on the phone or computer since 6 a.m. If you don't do it, it's not going to get done. So grit is incredibly important. Believing that what you're doing is worthwhile is important. And I would round it out with having the right business partners, the right leadership team is critically important. I think the talk about the solopreneur, right, that, we still hear about in Silicon Valley circles or with the advent of AI, a lot of people talk about, that single solopreneur who could be the world's first trillionaire or something.
Yep.
I think that's a little far fetched.
Mhm.
I still think you have a support system internal to the company.
Mhm.
I know very few people that have built a successful company all by themselves.
Mhm.
Usually there's at least one partner, probably two or more.
Mhm. Yeah, I loved how you said that. Being an entrepreneur in any space, it's a slugfest. And you're gonna get hit
Mhm.
hard, and there's gonna be days where you don't believe in yourself, and the days where you're stressed out of your mind. But ultimately, you're the one that has to do the work. So having
Mhm.
that mindset change, I feel like everybody kind of goes through. Of this is supposed to be hard, but the sacrifice, is ultimately worth it, as well as the solo entrepreneur. It's overrated. I heard that same thing of we're gonna have the first billionaire or trillionaire self-made one with just AI. Um, are we gonna see a lot more people with smaller teams due to AI? I think so, yes. I think now with applications
Mhm.
like Claude AI, where you can
Agreed.
have like an AI assistant that's programmed into your computer that can write all your emails and do all your follow-ups and do all those tasks. I think that's gonna cut a lot of admin work for you, where you have smaller teams of one, two, three, four people that make a lot of money. But I think the most important thing is to have those people in your corner, like you said, if it's a business partner or even if it's like a mentor or something, those people to hold you accountable where you can consult
Mhm.
with and go to, right, in times of needs when you're stresses, because we don't have all the answers. We don't, right? And you know what I mean? The worst thing you can do is try to make you know, do it on your own and make a bunch of mistakes, because that's going to hold you back, because why not consult with someone else that's made the same mistakes, right? Where you don't have to make those mistakes, you just win. So that's how I look at it. Now, Dan, if you had a magic wand, right? And you can erase one of the biggest problems in your business, what would that problem you would erase be?
If I could erase just one problem, and it's a big problem for small businesses in the federal space, I would, wave a magic wand to make streamlining and onboarding into government contracting vehicles a hell of a lot easier than it is current. We talk a lot about, or, you might hear the president or senior leaders in the federal government talk about how they want, good ideas. They want new products and they want them brought into government like ASAP, right? It's actually very hard to do that as a
Mhm.
technology company. Yeah, there's some incubators or accelerators out there, but by and large, it's very hard to get through barriers of entry into the government federal contracting space.
Mhm.
And that's why you see a lot of companies that just don't want to do it. I have one very good friend. He's had a very successful company. They have an amazing platform, but he will not go through the government onboarding process because it's expensive. They have a product, they have to go through FedRAMP. To get
Mhm.
FedRAMP accredited could cost you for one product alone between 600,000 and $1 million. Yeah, maybe a Microsoft or a Google or a Amazon could do that, but if you're a small business or a medium-sized business, that's out of reach, and I think that's a real shame.
Mhm.
And I am hopeful that some of the reforms we're seeing in the Small Business Administration with reforming some of the socioeconomic programs, I'm very optimistic that maybe that'll help lessen those. But I really think you need a concerted effort, and we'll see what happens with this roll up of contracting vehicles under GSA, the Government Services Administration. You need to have an easier way to onboard companies and actually let them compete to bring the best, brightest people and tools to the government market.
Love it. Now, Dan, where could the viewers find you if they want to hear and see more of you?
I think I got a pretty decent digital footprint. I mean, you're not going to find me on, Facebook or Instagram or anything like that. I'm pretty much on LinkedIn, just search for Dan Van Wagenen. I believe I'm the only one who shows up. And I do post occasionally on Twitter or X. I'm more of a lurker and, like pictures of cats and food and things like that. But if you want to follow me there, I'm at DV Wag.
Awesome. Well, Dan, I enjoyed our conversation, and I thank you for coming on the podcast to speak with the viewers here and give us your wonderful insight on both the commercial and the government side of things. Thank you, Dan,
Well, thank you. I had a great time and look forward to another conversation someday, D'Angelo.
for sure. Awesome. All right, guys. See you in the next episode. All right. Now, Dan, can you tell us a little bit more about the people that you kind of consult with? Who's currently in your network that you are learning from? So to fast track you to make sure that you're not making the mistakes that you don't need to make.
That's a really good question. I was blessed very early on in my professional career. The U.S. Army is always big on developing soldiers, developing leaders. And it was very easy to get a mentor that could teach you how to be a better soldier, better leader, better technical expert in whatever your career field was.
Mhm.
And that does carry over into the private sector. So I was very fortunate when I transitioned from government to private industry that I met some really amazing people that to this day are still kind of my guiding lights, right? It's very important, I think, for people to find individuals that have been there, done that, have that t-shirt, but
Mhm.
also share their values and want to see the industry as a whole grow and people be successful. I would not be where I'm at today without like my business partner. This is our third company working together, first one we've owned,
Mhm.
but we also had amazing people. You heard me talk about getting our FCL. Minerva would have never gotten where it is today without Jeff Bullock, who's the CEO of Clear Ridge Defense, very good friend of mine, and just one of those people that I can call and say, hey, I'm looking at this, request for information, a request for proposal, and do you think this is wired for somebody, or what do you think? And he'll be very candid with me with where the industry is going, where the opportunities are. Same thing with David Tone at BTS. I mean, he's another shoulder that I can kind of lean on if, I have questions or maybe I encounter a situation I've never been in before. I think, one of the best things your viewers can do if they're just starting a career, or maybe they're planning to grow in their career or pivot to a new career, is
Mhm.
find somebody who's been there, who's done that, who can be a guide.
Mhm.
Because I hate to say it, there's a lot of people out there that will derail you simply because they get some sort of perverse pleasure out of
Mhm.
it. And you want to be able to very quickly discern who's who and keep away from the latter while tying yourself to the former.
I love that. I love how, the best thing anybody can do when they're trying to become better in something is to find someone that has already done it and that can mentor you. That is the period in anything when it comes to any niche, any space, any market. Best thing you can do. Now, can you tell us
Mhm.
a little about your how you and your business partner, you guys' plans not just for this year of growth, but what are your guys' plans for the foreseeable future, a couple years out, in 2028, 2029, 2030, just a few years away? Where do you guys want to carry your company to?
So we do have metrics. I don't want to go into all of them here. It'll probably put people
Mhm.
to sleep, but a lot of those benchmarks
Mhm.
are tied around headcount and money that comes in and where we're at in terms of customer numbers and things like that.
Mhm.
Ideally, 3 years from now, I would like to see Minerva Cyber be in a place where maybe we're transitioning out of the small business category into a medium sized company.
Mhm.
I think it's perfectly healthy for a company to leave the small business ratings,
Mhm.
based off your NAICS code and, compete with the big boys. A lot
Mhm.
of other people want to steer away from that. There's nothing wrong with that. But I want to build this company with my business partner into something that will long outlive us.
Mhm. Awesome, awesome. That's a huge challenge, but I think that you'll be the man to do it. Now, where do you see the industry going? You know what I mean, in these upcoming years, how the space is kind of changing around you.
Well, if you're talking tech in general, I mean, AI is certainly going to eat a lot of work roles, a lot of companies that we see today, as things like Claudebot, right? Or I'm sorry, OpenClaw, bring agentic AI to the individual user. Me as a small business owner, I use it to automate a ton of processes.
Mhm.
So I don't necessarily need to hire, let's just say a project manager or a technical director. I can do a lot of that using my various agents. I think it's going to be very interesting. But
Mhm.
one thing I will share with you and your viewership is I don't think AI is going to be the doomsday that a lot of people think it is with preventing college grads from going into the workforce or allowing people to transition jobs. I
Mhm.
think as new AI disciplines come online, I think that's really going to be the new opportunities, the new
Mhm.
wild west, right? For people to go and develop their skills and get new jobs and higher wages and be able to achieve the American dream.
Yeah, I think the I heard someone I we had a conversation with somebody a little bit ago in a past podcast. He said that when the banks came out with ATMs, he compared it to everybody saying that, there's gonna be no more bank tellers, right? It's all gonna be through ATMs. But, fast forward to 2026, I walk in a bank and I see bank tellers still in the bank, right?
Mm,
AI is not gonna take everybody's job. It's only going to maneuver the way that people do business, small businesses especially, because it's gonna take away a lot of admin work. If you're smart and you're capable and you have the skills still needed, because AI can't do everything. You still need human to human interaction at the end of the day. You still need,
correct.
you know what I mean, a human oversight on many things, right? We're very far out from having just strictly AI oversight. So I like what you said that AI is not going to take people's jobs. It's not going to stop people from going to college. I think a lot of this is going to make, what I mean, human life easier, especially for these small businesses to be able to compete, with the larger companies like they never had before, right? Now, can we kind of hop back onto to growth on your commercial side of things? What have you been seeing that's been the most effective way of client acquisition?
So just in a nuts and bolts
Mhm,
setting, I think a lot of clients want an easy button.
mhm,
Most people don't understand cybersecurity. They don't want to take the time to wrap their head around it. And it is. It's a complex
mhm,
field. It's an advanced field.
mhm,
So, I think being able to provide either personnel, professional services or
mhm,
tooling centered around being that easy button, I think is the way.
mhm,
So if we're using, a Google Workspace suite or, an 65 suite to get them up to speed and get them
mhm,
secure for whatever their enclave is, I think that's the way to go while providing the professional services to supplement those products and tooling. I think
mhm,
that's the perfect ratio. And that seems to be catching on with people. They realize, there is no one tool or platform or piece of software that does everything.
mhm.
You have to find that right. It's like Legos, right? You got to connect them together the right way that fits your needs.
Yeah, speaking more about, like, client relations and stuff like that, one thing that I've heard is what separates people from other people is when you speak to these business owners on the commercial side, they don't fully understand cyber or all the applications you use. If you speak to them, in business terms, now you're speaking business to business,
Mhm.
a language that they actually understand. Have you kind of been seeing that as well? And what is your approach to speaking with these business owners that have no idea what cyber is? Maybe they're hitting you up because they want some type of cyber insurance and they need to, work with you guys to be able to qualify for that insurance, etc. How do you kind of speak their language instead of speaking the technical out?
Well, I think it's that personal touch, right? The
Mhm,
the goal of any good small business or any business in general is to find out what the customer needs and then to
mhm,
kind of guide them. And what I mean by that is I just had an interesting encounter with a company. They didn't know what they didn't know. And, they kind of came to us with, well, we know we have this regulation we have to meet and this one over here. And, we kind of held their hand and took them through, okay, here's a roadmap of based off what you're telling us you need, and here's what it costs. And, we can kind of go more granular from there. I think that's the big differential where a lot of the big companies, it's kind of, one size fits all. And on the commercial side, that doesn't fly with a lot of people. If you're dealing with a private bank, that's going to be different than dealing with a JP Morgan, a
mhm,
worldwide or Deutsche Bank type institution. You really have to go in there and ascertain what their needs are, what their pain points are, what their budgets are, because it doesn't mean anything if you go in there with a solution that they can't afford. And especially as a small business owner, I can't afford to not get paid. So I think it's that personal touch, that communication, that open kimono discussion with them that makes the difference. And I can't tell you how many people and entities we engage that are like, oh, thank God, you don't come in here like, I won't name the company, but they had dealt with somebody else that
mhm,
basically treated them like dullards and idiots. And that's not the way to
mhm.
do it. You got to have that certain level of tact to be successful.
Out of all the conversations you have, how many of these business owners see the value that you bring to their company through your service?
I mean, I think they all recognize that cybersecurity is important. Defending your
Mhm,
enclave, your IP, your customer base, your secret sauce is important.
mhm,
It's just how much do they want to make the investment to, bring those capabilities to bear.
mhm,
And I think one of the things Minerva does very well, whether we're meeting with a government client or a teaming partner on the federal side, or a customer, a B2B customer on the commercial side. I'm sorry, government or commercial side, it's just being able to meet their needs. It's being
mhm,
able to fulfill the terms and conditions of the contract that we bid for. It's being able to do an assessment, a pre-assessment of where they're at, what they can share with us, which allows us to then say, okay, here's what we can do for you. I see that as the perfect mix that closes a deal. So probably out of most of the folks we engage with, I'd say our close rate is probably around 50%.
mhm,
And the remaining 50 that doesn't go with us, it's not normally a slide. Maybe it's not in their budget for that period and they'll come back at a later date, or
mhm.
maybe we're not a good fit. Maybe there's somebody looking for, let's just say, digital forensics, or maybe something we don't necessarily do as a cybersecurity firm, like help desk ticketing or stuff like that. We'll
Mhm,
gladly refer them to a partner we know and trust to meet that need.
mhm.
So, reputation, being able to communicate effectively, all those things matter in the business world to be successful.
What do you think that a lot of these businesses get wrong about what cybersecurity is?
I think there's a preconceived notion that cyber is not important,
Mhm,
even though everybody has, like, one of these things which can be compromised. And, there's
mhm,
banking and personal health information on there. And the other half is that they don't want to pay for it. If I'm on Microsoft Windows and I have Defender, well, I'm safe, right? Well, maybe not exactly. You want to make sure, especially as a business owner or somebody in the business world, that your assets
mhm,
are protected. You know what systems you have, an asset inventory. You want to know what your tech stack looks like. You want to know what's out there trying to get in by looking at log files
mhm,
or having cyber threat intelligence feed. There's just so much stuff out there that can hurt you, whether you're aware of it or not. And just to kind of give you a kinetic analogy, when I was in the army and we were conducting combat operations in Iraq or Afghanistan, we used to talk about civilians on the battlefield, or we,
mhm,
using military acronyms, we just called them COBs.
mhm,
And, you got to be cognizant of those. You just can't open fire at the enemy because many times they're going to take cover behind those COBs.
mhm,
Well, in cyber, especially in today's day and age, anybody who has one of these, or, I have a smartwatch, or,
mhm,
we're talking on a laptop computer or something, or a
mhm,
tablet, everything is connected. That makes everything a target, which
mhm,
means every man, woman, and child with a smart device is a cob in the cyber battle space. So, what you don't know in this case can hurt you. And I think it would help if either schools taught cybersecurity principles with information technology principles early on, or maybe just as a society, we were a little bit more savvy to
mhm,
cybersecurity, like not having TikTok on your phone. I'm probably going to offend a lot of people, but it's a large Chinese data hub.
mhm.
There's certain apps out there you don't want on your devices because they exfil data to bad actors. It's a very scary world we live in that way. But I do have hope again for the future because of what we're seeing with AI, what we're seeing with developments in cyber defense. And, I hope and pray that we're going to be okay.
To those companies now that don't see any value in cyber, what would you exactly tell them? And what do you wish that they were able to consider or able to understand and see?
If a company were to completely blow off having some sort of cyber posture, I would say one of two things, depending on how big they are. One, be prepared to have all your information on the dark web, which could, also
Mhm,
put you on the, front page of the New York Times in not a positive
mhm,
light. Or if you're a really big company, I would say your congressional testimony is going to suck because you're probably going to be subpoenaed to go before some committee or subcommittee on the Hill, and it's
mhm,
not going to be pleasant.
mhm,
Much like anything else in life, if I drive my car or you drive your car and you
mhm,
don't have insurance and you get into an accident, there's repercussions, right? There's
mhm,
consequences. It's
mhm.
no different in the digital world, even if we can't see it with the naked eye.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I wouldn't say it's mainly these enterprise businesses at all. I would say it's mainly these smaller businesses that really only see IT guys as someone to come in and fix their computer or fix their laptop once in a while, or to give them a call to fix some type of application. Now, can you kind of tell us about how you first started your company, a little bit more about your military background and how you've really seen that there was an opportunity for you to start a company here in cyber?
Yeah, I think it was a number of factors. When I left the government, I hadn't held a civilian job in a very long time. And I knew I wanted to go into business because, the perks were better. You don't get paid a lot as infantry soldier, for example, compared to a
Mhm,
corporate executive. So I wanted to build something beautiful, but I also knew I didn't have the knowledge or the experience to come out of the gate and be a founder or a co-founder. So even though, again, I had trolled, YN and, different business forums or read books, nothing substitutes experience. So I deliberately went into the private workforce with the intention to learn as much as I could about not just the technical aspect of delivery with a customer, but other aspects of business. How does payroll work? How does the insurances work? How do you deal with HR? How do you build a project management office? What kind of project management office or PMO do you build? How do you manage humans?
Mhm,
How do you interact with a board? Maybe doesn't have the same priorities as your customer.
mhm,
Those are all the things I wanted to find out how to do. And after, 6, 7 years of working at very successful companies, I felt I had learned enough with my business partner that we kind of looked at each other one day and it's like, why are we making other people rich when we could go out and do this ourselves?
mhm,
So that's exactly what we did.
mhm,
I mean, she had been in the private sector far longer than I had, going back to the comments about a mentor. I mean, I learn stuff from Kim every day.
mhm,
And I think that's a very healthy business relationship to have because
mhm.
you don't want to go into business with someone who's just like you. If you're
Yeah.
going to be in a partnership of some sort, you want to balance each other out. One person has strengths, the other doesn't, and vice
Mhm,
versa. I've seen a lot of early stage tech startups go the way of the dodo because you had two very similar people or more that conflicted with each other.
mhm,
So that chemistry is very important when you make the decision to start a company because you can almost think of it like a marriage. You're
mhm,
married to those other people and you have
mhm.
to pull together in the good times and the
I completely agree. If you guys are the same person, you guys are going into business with each other, you guys can both be great at your craft, but if you're both good at the same exact thing, there's A, going to be conflictions about who does what, and B, there's a lot of things that you guys are need to be good at, right? And it's going to take time to be good at those things. So that's going to be just a huge handicap to your growth. So I completely agree on that. Now, Dan, where could the viewers find you if they want to hear and see more of you?
Oh, I think I got a pretty decent digital footprint. I mean, you're not going to find me on, Facebook or Instagram or anything like that. I'm pretty much on LinkedIn, just search for Dan Van Wagenen. I believe I'm the only one who shows up. And I do post occasionally on Twitter or X. Um, I'm more of a lurker and, like pictures of cats and food and things like that. But if you want to follow me there, I'm at DVWag.
Mhm. Awesome. Well, Dan, I enjoyed our conversation, and I thank you for coming on the podcast to speak with the viewers here and give us your wonderful insight on both the commercial and the government side of things. Um, I thank you, Dan,
Oh, thank you. I had a great time and look forward to another conversation someday, DeAngelo.
for sure. Awesome. All right, guys. See you in the next episode.